Okay, today's topic is on the Medici, the famous or infamous Italian Catholic bankers. Now, it's going to be less of a focus of the art and the material expressions and results of the Medici. So, let's focus on the culture and more on the literature that grounds the justification for the different behaviors the Medici involved themselves in. So it's going to be an emphasis on this medieval Gnostic and Kabbalistic traditions. Now, Gnosticism simply is just Jewish mysticism mixed with Neoplatonism and Christianity. So we're going to be talking a lot about these principles from these traditions. And speaking of principles, we will be looking at first principles by Origen, because he is a Neoplatonist from the second century, and he was teaching in Alexandria. And he was very learned in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. And we'll be looking at his thought more later in his metaphysics and how that influenced centuries later these medieval bankers. So we're looking specifically at international trade. And they didn't have PayPal or Zelle. No Venmo back then, so there was long distance traveling when it comes to these different business contracts and exchange deals is what they would call it, and by they I mean the Medici. So these different currency exchanges, market speculation, pretty much forex trading before it existed. These Italian bankers were very sophisticated, and they used metaphysics and spirituality to justify these behaviors. Lastly, we'll look at the papal finance and how the structure of kind of a monarchy with the Pope and having subordinate structures under the Pope, cardinals, bishops, priests, and then the local parish members, and how all of this ultimately forms the Renaissance and affects the social structure. So, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew are strongly recommended to study, hopefully for obvious reasons. But a good distillation was on the cross where Jesus Christ was crucified. There was the sign that read King of the Jews, and it was written in three languages. And I hope you can take a guess at what three languages were written on that cross. So we're going to continue with our first slide, which is focused mostly on the methodology and with an emphasis on the economy and esotericism. So things that are hidden, not so obvious. Because within the Catholic tradition, you have faith and reason. There are certain ideas and principles and theories that we do know and we can show through proof. Maybe they're self evident, but there's other things we do not know, which is why you need faith. And some of our primary sources, St. Augustine's going to be the main source. We're going to see he's the ultimate source of where the Medici drive their principles, but it's not going to be as obvious of how St. Augustine influenced them because, as I mentioned here, he did not write systematic economy theory or economic theories, but rather he had ideas on morality and applied that to issues like justice, usury, and the common good, which then St. Thomas Aquinas later took up. And St. Thomas Aquinas is the main justification that the Medici use. but it all stems from St. Augustine. And this is going to show how it shaped the Christian world and made this moral and legal environment possible. So, The City of God's a very important book to read. As I said, it's going to be the main grounding of these ideas. Then you have Pseudo Dionysius. Now, ancient writer, I think from the 5th century, but the Greek manuscripts arrived later, and we're going to talk about this character, Marsilio Ficino, which is why he's in bold. He's the one who translated these ancient Greek texts to Latin, and it was the Medici who financed and pretty much campaigned for Marsilio Ficino's work. We wouldn't know Marsilio Ficino unless the Medici helped create the Florentine Academy, the Medici Academy, and these different institutions that really scaled these ideas. We'll also look at Cosimo and Lorenzo de' Medici, and we're going to also see some of Marsilio's students, like Pico, but we'll talk about Pico later. And like I said, a main theme is going to be this Neoplatonism. And Neoplatonism simply is the rational argumentation for spirituality. If you know anything about Plato, his sentences were very long. He used logical deductions, just like Aristotle, but many people say that Plato was more focused on the mind, the heavens, the forms is what he called it, while Aristotle was focused mostly on biology, things you can touch, things you can experiment on. So this Neoplatonism is very in the head. And we'll know an ancient Greek principle on the Temple of Delphi says, know thyself. And so Plato was a big part of this tradition of knowing thyself and ultimately purifying your passions. And what that does is eliminate cognitive bias. That way you don't see what you want to see, but you are seeing reality, seeing what's real. So you are no longer descending into chaos and confusion, but you are rather ascending into knowledge and divine revelation. This was Neoplatonism. We're going to talk a lot about the guilds, which are like modern day monopolies. They focus on certain products. They have a big influence on brand awareness, logistics, inventory, customer service. These guilds are very critical to understanding the economy within this Renaissance era. And of course, you have the councils, magistrates, and these ideas represent a celestial hierarchy. So we'll later see these Gnostic principles, such as above, so below. Like what happens in the heavens happens on earth, which is why a lot of ancient civilizations base their temples off of the order and structure of the heavens. So they would align their temples based off of the stars, the planets. We're going to talk a lot about charging interest. And this comes mostly from Aquinas. Because as I said, St. Augustine does not clearly talk about economics. But what St. Thomas Aquinas does is he takes what St. Augustine wrote on morality and justice and applies that to his modern issues, which are things like usury and exploitation of the everyday laborer. So it's kind of funny when Karl Marx comes way later with his idea of socialism and how reality is based off of this tension between the oppressed and the oppressor. And you can see where Marx gets these ideas from. I would argue it stems from St. Thomas Aquinas and how he was very against usury, charging too much interest. Now, that's a very simple definition of usury. We'll talk about that later. It's a very complex topic, but for now, charging too much interest is usury. So we'll stick with that definition for now. But St. Thomas Aquinas, he argued that charging interest is permissible if it's compensated for risk. And it's interesting when you have problems like in 2008 within the American markets, you have these subprime mortgages being sold out to borrowers who don't qualify income or assets. And these loans are, as we think, liabilities for the lender. It's very high risk for the lender because these borrowers don't have high income, which you can then presume will not be able to pay for the loan. Therefore, the loan is high risk and the risk is shared. But in reality, it's not quite structured like that because you have things like bank bail ins where the government comes in and saves these banks. So you have this tension between local regional banks and the federal government monetary policy. So we can apply all of these issues to modern day principles, definitely, because we're talking about shared risk within loans. But Thomas Aquinas really focused on this risk and its relationship to labor. And he does highly value labor. I would argue he thinks labor is the source of most value, and therefore the laborer, those who are working, should be treated with justice, equal wages, and not exploited. Again, you can see kind of how socialism can grab what has been already existed within the Renaissance Catholic European milieu. Now, as I mentioned before, humans can't know everything by reason, so some truths must be accepted on authority. That's another thing we'll talk about is what's the normative authority for these banking practices? Is it the Pope? Is it your community? What's the normative authority to determine these banking practices? And a way that the Medici bankers would avoid usury, being Catholic, and it's a question of how did the Medici get so rich if usury is sinful? Well, they would find ways around usury where they'd have practices that seem usurious, but they're not, and they're justified through mystical, spiritual rationale. But the specific banking practice that would justify uh, speculating on foreign currencies or manufacturing and trade deals and community banks and this idea of centralized banking is distilled within bills of exchange, is what they would call these contracts, these business contracts. And as I mentioned, these credit networks. So, how does Venice and Florence and other parts in Europe, how are they either working together or working against each other to form these different networks? So you have long distance banking, and it really depends on the trust of the mediators. And this trust kind of is grounded from these main, as I said, philosophical and spiritual principles. If you don't share the same God, you don't worship the same God, you don't have the same interpretation of that God, it's hard to trust that person when it comes to different business deals. So sharing those ideas certainly helps. And I would argue that's what made these Medici so powerful, was this unity within Europe. Not everything was unified. There was a lot of skirmishes. I wouldn't say wars, but small battles that were funded by the Medici. But ultimately, Europe was quite unified, uh, comparing to other regions in the world at the time. So how did Europe come up with these art pieces and these cathedrals? They were unified through these mystical theologies. And then these are all the sources that I'm looking at for this methodology. And we'll end with origin. As I kind of teased before, um, Origin thought that there's a lot of stability that comes from being spiritual. You get a stability from sharing spiritual practices. You get a higher purpose, and so this authority is exercised through uh, this hierarchy. For example, Origin is known as a subordinationist. And he's also known within the Catholic and Orthodox tradition as a heretic for this subordination theory that God the Father is the ultimate monarch and Jesus Christ is subordinate to God the Father, and then the Holy Spirit is subordinate to Jesus Christ. It's a hierarchical and celestial structure. And we'll talk more about Origin later, but we're moving on now to Florence and how it became a theological and economic laboratory. And the purpose of this slide is just to show how moral theology structured this economy. We'll get more specific on how. So we're looking back at St. Thomas Aquinas and his Summa Theologiae, which is his masterpiece, I would say, his most well-known work. It's very big. But this particular section, 77 through 78, talks about usury and justice. And we'll see direct quote from St. Thomas Aquinas: interest is illicit if it is compensate for actual loss, risk, and labor. So again, labor is very important to St. Thomas Aquinas. You can't just charge interest and not have a shared risk. That's what he's trying to say, is there has to be a shared risk between the lender and the borrower. Since the borrower is the laborer, the borrower is the one with the ultimate um, leverage, not the lender, which has been switched, because the lender is not the one who labors. And we'll see later that um, a more poetic argument and less theological argument comes from Dante, where he puts sodomites and usurers on the same level of hell because Aristotle said money is sterile. And we hopefully know that it's man and woman who can create life. So that is a fertile relation, unlike sodomy. And if money is sterile, like Aristotle said, then the usurer takes what is sterile, money, and makes it fertile through compound interest. So therefore, they're on a equal level of injustice, and we're going to dive deeper into that idea later. But we're on the theological explanation for these thoughts. So these bills of exchange did allow money to travel, and you have fees that would compensate risk. It's not just the use of money. And you have Bernardino of Siena, different sermons on usury. And with this, you have more of a focus on public charity and the more practical and outward expressions and manifestations of banking. What should be the practical outcome of banking? Well, Bernardino thought that you should build churches, you should build hospitals, and you should donate to religious orders. Um, Again, these are the principles that created such magnificent and beautiful structures. So, banking is not just for the user or the lender, but it's for the people. And the way you know it's for the people is when there's visible piety and civic virtue. And we're going to look at a 15th century Archbishop of Florence, Antonius of Florence, and he has a Summa Theologia on moralis, or more specifically, we're looking at his economic sections. And he was focused, similar to Bernardino, on the actionable ethics for these daily commercial activities, not just market speculations, getting rich from various contracts, but creating and building things. So, hierarchy is natural and moral. This is a proposition you have to accept in order for this Medici structure to manifest, because everyone has a proper place. And this does go back to scripture and how I believe I'm paraphrasing, that there's one glory of the sun and another of the moon. So different manifestations of glory within the celestial heavens. And we can assume that's similar to how it is on earth. So this is going to reinforce material and social order, or the Catholic structure of the papacy. Here's a quote from Dante. He who orders his acts with reason and foresight governs rightly. For prudence harmonizes earthly labor with eternal law. Okay, that's interesting because, especially today, a lot of people don't have a lot of purpose when it comes to their work. But 500 years ago in Europe, people, the everyday worker, saw their earthly labor aligned with divine law. Now we're going to look specifically at the Medici Bank and how they use different occult mediations. And the purpose of this particular slide is to show accounting as symbolic and really epistemic in practice. So we'll get more into what that means, but we have Luca Pacioli, and this particular figure is quite fascinating. He really did transform bookkeeping. And so we have every transaction recorded twice. We know debit and a credit. And this allowed for more organized form of banking. And Italy's always been quite organized when it comes to their military, their politics, their social order. But here's where Italy gets extremely organized when it comes to economics. If you think of the Roman Empire and how the centurions and the structure with the Senate, and you have the emperor, and you have the orderly fashion between the military. We have the Carthaginians even noting how organized the military was, the Roman military. So organization's another thing we're looking at, because this organization allowed for calculating interest and really risk management. Make sure you have a good return on your investment. And so another source is going to be directly from the Medici Bank account books. There are selective archival excerpts that I look at, but this specific ones is the letter between the Medici managers and the agents and clients. So there's this network between the managers, the agents, and the clients. And this is scaled on a universal, not just within one city or province. It's Florence, Rome, Venice. So it's multiple branches, similar to maybe how a regional bank might have a branch focused on home loans, and then another branch focused on the stock market and market speculation. So this was already done in the 14th century Europe. Now we're going to look at a 14th century merchant, Francisco di Marco, and he was involved in the textile business. And we do have archives preserved from him. And he gave clear guidance on loans, payments, and contracts. If you want a deeper dive on that, look at Francisco di Marco. The last person we'll look at is Alberti. And he was an architect and a humanist. So he believed in the greatness of God and therefore the greatness of man. And man and God have this symbiotic relationship. There was a saint that said, God became man so man could become like God. And so this is economic and ethical reflections that do warn against greed and excessive risk for the borrower. So I wonder what Alberti would say about the 2008 subprime mortgages. Here's the main meat and potatoes of this lecture is Gnosticism and these motifs. So we look at the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Truth. Now, this isn't Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This is the Gnostic Gospels, so not canonical according to the Catholic and Orthodox Church, but these are old texts that reveal certain spiritual and political truths. We'll look at Valentinus, another Gnostic group, and Irenaeus, who was against all these Gnostic literature and Gnostic practices, because the whole reason why you have councils like the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD was to refute the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Truth, and Valentinus. For example, the Nicene Creed was the product of the Council of Nicaea, and that creed will reaffirm beliefs, but also simultaneously remove, in their eyes, heretics like Gnosticism. So if you look at figures like Meister Eckhart, which is this German mystic, we'll see some of his sermons that kind of uh, bounce off these Gnostic ideas. Let me get a quick drink of my Sprite. And I want to emphasize that this tradition, Gnosticism, is not some underground, obscure, and outdated system. Still quite popular today. It just manifests in different labels, such as I'm spiritual, not religious, or part of the nuns, the non-religious affiliated people, but they still practice spirituality, maybe astrology or using crystals, manifestations, things like that. Now, Eckhart was a theologian and a Dominican, and he focused a lot on this inner discernment. As I said, true knowledge of God comes from within the soul, not from external authority or ritual. We'll see later how these thinkers affect the Protestant Reformation and Martin Luther, who didn't fully reject rituals, because the reformers I define as Martin Luther and John Calvin as the original founders of these Protestant ideas. Both John Calvin and Martin Luther believed in infant baptism, confession, liturgical calendars, just not as a big emphasis as the Catholic Church on rituals, but Protestant, by definition, used and affirmed the use of rituals. When I say Protestantism, a lot of people think of the evangelicals, which are very popular in America. But that comes from a restoration movement, which comes way later after John Calvin and Martin Luther. And the American institutions were not founded off of this restoration movement. The American tradition was found off the Puritans, who were Calvinists. And like I said, Calvin believed in ritual. To add on to this Gnostic theme, we now look at Jewish Kabbalah, which is a big pillar of Gnosticism. Since this is the start of Christianity, and Christianity claims to be the fulfillment of the Jewish law, as Jesus Christ himself said, I came to fulfill the law, meaning the Jewish law. He came to fulfill the Jewish law, not abolish it. So there's this connection we know between Judaism and Christianity. And the primary sources we're looking at this Kabbalah is the Sefer Yetzirah and the Zohar. Now, these sources, also the Moses de Leon and Abraham Abulafia, really focus on numerology, which these Jewish sages and writers got this idea of numerology from Plato, since Plato heavily emphasizes geometry, math being a eternal truth, which then represents the eternal truth of the one or God. Math being kind of a divine practice for Plato and obviously for Pythagoras. And then you have like stories in the Hebrew scriptures, such as Solomon's temple. If you read that portion where it talks about the temple, the Bible, Hebrew Bible, is very specific on how that temple should be structured symmetrically, aesthetically, with geometry and the right mathematical procedures, not arbitrary practices. So letters and numbers give proportion and really govern reality. So numerology is very critical to Kabbalah. So again, we're talking about mathematical order, and ultimately, what this does is affect banking ledgers and architecture. Now, there's a form of Christian Kabbalah, because before we were looking strictly at the Hebrew Kabbalah and the Gnosticism within that, and the early rabbis who did reject the ecumenical councils, therefore rejecting the canonical, the official canon of the Bible. The Gnostics reject that. But the Christian Kabbalists or the Christian Gnostics did accept the canon of the Bible. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John being the official scripture is what I mean by the canon. Um, we're looking at figures like Marsilio Ficino, who's this man right here. He was a humanist priest. He was also a physician. Many videos on him, and we've had a few studies on him because he's very critical to this movement. Um, you have his Marsilio Ficino student Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. Big figure. Pico wrote a lot on um, Kabbalism and therefore Christian Kabbalism, trying to adopt these mathematical methods and Ficino's Neoplatonic hierarchy. Ficino was very into astrology, similar to St. Thomas Aquinas' teacher, St. Albert Magnus, who is the doctor of the Catholic Church, just like St. Thomas Aquinas, but Albertus Magnus was focused very much on astronomy, science, and Ficino followed that. He, unlike many modern Christians, believe that studying the universe will bring you closer to God. It's not arbitrary to pursue scientific endeavors. Um, um, Unlike maybe more of the Protestant thought, which is based off of Luther's three pillars: sola fide, sola gratia, sola scriptura, faith alone, grace alone, scripture alone. Well, what about science? Well, there's no need for science. Well, how come there's no need for science? Well, because it's faith alone, grace alone, and scripture alone. So there's that division within Christian thought, and especially modern thought. But this Renaissance era really was kind of the pregnancy of the Enlightenment and French Revolution, and people like Immanuel Kant and Descartes all started here. And this idea of faith and reason, and the argumentation for faith and reason was based on Neoplatonism. So everything in the universe is connected by number and proportion, and nothing is without reason or measure, and that's what Pico said. Again, Pico was a student of Marsilio Ficino. Marsilio Ficino was a humanist, physician, and a priest. And through the study of the holy letters of the Hebrews, and if you learn just simple parts of the Hebrew language, especially the ancient Hebrew language, a lot of every letter, I should say, represents there's a symbol or a meaning, like bet. Bet has a, the symbol for bet is like a house. And so you have the word like Bethlehem, which is the house of bread. And each letter, particular letter in the Hebrew language, is represented, like I said, by a symbol and also a number. And what's interesting about the Hebrew language is it's all consonants. Um, the vowels and the pronunciation of the word and the sentence is not obvious. You need the oral tradition, not just the learning of the words. You need the oral tradition to get the full interpretation, which is kind of where Kabbalah comes in and the rabbis come in. You need this Kabbalistic training, which Kabbalah just means passed on. You need this passed on to you by someone. You can't just kind of come up with it on your own. Even though the main principle of Kabbalism or Gnosticism is self knowledge, um, it is kind of a misleading if you say that Kabbalah is just a simple or simply uh, self journey, self reflection. Uh, it involves a community of interpretations. And another quote we'll look at by Ficino: there is no truth in God's law that does not glorify human reason. And the sages of Israel and Greece point to the same divine light. Actually, I'm sorry, that was Pico, but Pico and Ficino are very similar. Okay, that was Christian Kabbalism. Now we're looking at the hidden knowledge, and we're going to look more at um, calculation and organization within banking. These are the sources we're also looking at too. We're going back to Pseudo Dionysius, that ancient Greek writer, and these sources blend mysticism and humanism with political governance. Unlike many secular nations that reject religion as a whole or within an institutional basis, especially oftentimes in the American workforce, you hear there's two topics you cannot talk about. Everything else is open. The two topics you cannot talk about within the American workplace is politics and religion. Well, if someone came up with that proposition in the 1500s of Europe, you would get laughed at because politics and religion are married. Because humans can shape the world through action. And despite the infinite complexity of reality, you can still ascend to knowledge, Neoplatonism. Unlike nihilism, like I said, secularism, that idea of don't talk about religion or politics comes from this nihilistic tradition, maybe with Marx and then Nietzsche. This is completely refuted and would be laughed at, according to these Renaissance humanist uh, teachings. But we'll look in the next slide, in the next two slides, about calculation and the different methods in calculating business contracts and making sure that you are ethical and following order and being intellectually sound, not confused. So now we're looking at the knowledge of hierarchies. So this is probably one of the most interesting topics because this corpus hermeticum is a probably next to the Zohar the most well-known Gnostic text, and it's very apocalyptic, and its main principle of the corpus hermeticum, I quoted here: that which is above is like that which is below. So basically every action you take as a human is a spiritual or ritualized or mystical exercise. We base the calendar off of the structure of the solar system. So it's taking that as a more symbolic interpretation that the heavens or the eternal forms affect our day to day life. And we base our practices and our rituals off of these eternal truths and eternal forms. So you have banking contracts and civic projects. They're not just merely material. And that's a big difference from kind of today's modern day. If you look at, like I said, socialism, and if you look at the architecture, such as like brutalism within the Soviet Union, it's not focused on material beauty, but rather like the will to power. But this is not like that. This is the opposite of socialism and the rejection of beauty. This is the adoration and the celebration of beauty. Way different. Because this material matter is a way to manifest divine order on earth. So now we have from medieval economy to early capitalist theology. So we want to trace um, these ideas to people like Martin Luther, who wrote on trade and usury. So even differing Christian denominations share this idea that you want to let a man gain in business so that they may benefit others and glorify God. And so you don't want to get riches for riches' sake. You want to get riches so that you can benefit your brother, your sister, in your community. And this was echoed by John Calvin and Martin Luther and Bernardino of Siena. So this emphasis on moral responsibility, not just the will to power. Again, this is the opposite of socialism or nihilism. There's purpose to your labor. And the exploitation of that laborer is unjust, sinful, it's against God. So we will conclude with the banker as a metaphysician. And Dante is going to be our main source for this. The human race, being one, is governed by one ruler. This is where you get the justification for structures such as the papacy, which is rejected by all forms of Christianity other than Catholics. Orthodox have their authority. They do have local authority that is governed by one ruler. For example, Patriarch of Moscow is the one governing ruler of Russia. But you have other Orthodox churches, for example, in Greece. But Greece doesn't follow the Russian Patriarch. The Greek Orthodox Church follows the Greek Orthodox Patriarch or the EP, Ecumenical Patriarch. So there's a little difference. Orthodox focus more on local authority, while Catholics focus on the more centralized authority via the papacy. But monarchy is necessary. And this isn't an argument for or against monarchy, but it is just an objective analysis of like a constitutional republic. What is a democracy? What is a republic? Or what is a monarchy? What's the difference between these political systems? And then you look at, objectively look at the effects of the monarchy. For example, in Britain and these European lands, You look at Charlemagne, who was crowned, I believe, in the 8th century. Charlemagne was crowned emperor, so he was the king of the Germanic peoples. And if you look at the Holy Roman Empire, it lasted a long time, century. And so obviously, one could argue that monarchy is quite efficient when it comes to uh, governance, wealth, standard of living, culture, compared to, places like America, which is a constitutional republic, not a monarchy. And you just look at the fruits of America. So we justify the centralization of authority, and this gives the Medici. This is going to tie all back to the Medici. This gives the Medici the moral and intellectual legitimacy to be kind of the central bankers, the main monopoly, the main central bank for all of Europe. Well, how could those Medicis do that? That's selfish. That's tyrannical. Well, in their mind, the Medici's mind, it's justified because there is hierarchy in heaven. Therefore, there shouldn't be hierarchy on earth. And this is all forming this idea of interconnectedness. Now, this is what socialism does have similarities with this centralized structure. Is the centralized structure allows for unity and interconnectedness, and that's the main basis and main drive and the main objective, I would say, of socialism. Everyone owns the same property, it's all shared, you all get the same wages. It's focused a lot on that connection, the community. So to him, it is granted to be whatever he chooses to be. To him, it is granted to ascend to the highest things or descend to the lowest. So, again, Neoplatonism, you want to avoid cognitive bias, self delusion, inner conflict, depression, suicide, all those things. You want to avoid that. And how do you avoid that? Well, you study things like science, spirituality, and you follow the Neoplatonic tradition so that you can ascend and transcend those terrible things. And that's what Gnosticism really based off of, escaping the evil material world and ascending to the eternal divine realm. Um, Christianity does take a difference, even though Christianity, as I mentioned, within this specific time period, flirts a lot with Neoplatonism. But this is where Christianity and Neoplatonism diverge. Uh, the Christians don't believe that material is in itself evil, but has been redeemed by the blood of Christ. And the moment that his sacred blood touched the ground, according to the Christians, the earth has never been the same. And if you look at structures such as the Medici Bank and the Catholic Church, that's the fruits of that sacred blood. So the material itself isn't evil. There is an original stain, original sin on man through Adam, according to the Christians, but that is redeemed through holy baptism. You are a new creation in Christ. So here's a bonus slide. This is the last slide, and we're ending here. Now, all this Neoplatonic talk and unity and redemption and banking and culture and beauty, it's not all good. We have a lot of skirmishes and rivalries and evil behaviors and wicked people. And this kind of manifests most clearly distilled with the rivalry between Florence and Venice. Florence being this banking, kind of chaotic and dramatic um, tension with this Italian family. unlike Venice, which was focused a lot on trade and commerce. So there was this rivalry between these two superpowers. So they have different models. Both were commercial republics, not feudal kingdoms, similar to that feudal system in earlier Europe. Um, but some would argue it's not quite different from the feudal kingdoms because of this idea of the economic hierarchy with the papacy, the Medici, and the everyday laborer. But as I said, Venice focused more on its colonies and its fleets, um, more imperial, similar to how America um, gets involved with a lot of foreign problems because America, if you read the dollar bill, it says Novus Order or new order. It's a new order. It's the global order. That America is that stronghold to maintain global order. That's the claim for the Americans. Venice certainly follows that same idea, which is why Florence really did not like Venice, because Florence was more on finance and um, diplomacy. But we're going to look more at these guilds because I mentioned how important they are. They're basically the monopolies of the medieval time, and each guild had its specific product and specific specialty, such as the Della Lana Guild would focus a lot on the wool industry. So it's not just um, market speculations, but actual manufacturing, building real things, producing real things. And we'll look at later in modern times, such as America, we can see how America is shifting from the 20th century industrial manufacturing focus to now a more service based, financial based, debt based economy, less on manufacturing, more on market speculation. Well, that's today's lecture on the Medici between ledger and logos. Hope you enjoyed. Thank you for listening.